preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to our Real People, Real Issues program. My name is Susan Engel, and I direct the Adult Division in the Center for Adult Life and Learning. The purpose of this program has been to have prominent individuals from all walks of life share their thoughts and feelings about important issues confronting our society today. The focus this evening being on race relations. Before I introduce our moderator, I would like to just draw your attention to a letter that you've just been given, inviting you to become a friend of the Y. In these difficult economic times, the Y needs your support as a participant and as a donor so that we can continue to provide high-quality educational, cultural, and social service programs. We'd appreciate your designating your gift to the Center for Adult Life and Learning. I also want to remind you of some remaining lectures that we have planned this season in the month of May. We have such speakers as Dominic Dunn, Mary Ann Williamson, William F. Buckley Jr., and Leon Botstein. Also, our summer brochure has just come out, and if you haven't yet picked one up, you can pick one up from the usher on your way out. And now for tonight. I am once again delighted to introduce our moderator, who is a writer who has come to represent the highest standards in his profession. He is a man of enormous talent, creativity, wit, and integrity. In addition to being a contributing editor for the New Republic, Vanity Fair, Men's Journal, and Family Circle, we have come to eagerly await his original and thought-provoking essays on the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour. He is the author of many books, including the prize-winning Children of War. And next year, Random House will be publishing a collection of his essays called The Man in the Water. He has written 2 plays, Free Speech in America and you should be on the lookout for his new one-man show to be presented here at the Y next fall. He is the recipient of numerous journalistic awards, including an Emmy, a Peabody, and 2 George Polk Awards. Now to introduce our stellar panel for this evening, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Roger Rosenblatt.
Thanks very much. It's very good to see all of you again. Let me try to frame tonight's discussion with reference to 2 unlikely polar places, the pandemonium of our own city, New York, and the wasteland of the Sudan in the Horn of Africa. And I'm going to talk about, just briefly, the period roughly between 1988 and 1992. In New York, within those dates, the number of bias crimes reported in the city was 1,590. A bias crime, as you know, is one in which violence is attributed to an attack against someone's race, religion, or sexual orientation. The numbers break down to 655 incidents within those few years of anti-Semitism, 550 anti-black, 167 anti-white, 121 anti-Hispanic, 97 anti-Asian. For every bias crime reported, we must assume there were at least 100 not reported. The incidents that made the national news occurred in places like Howard Beach, Queens, where a gang of white young men beat up a group of blacks with bats, eventually chasing one black man onto a highway where he was hit and killed by a car. In Crown Heights, Brooklyn, in August 1991, an ambulance driven by a member of the Lubavitcher Orthodox Jewish sect veered out of control and killed a 7-year-old black child. The area was hurled into days of rioting, in which a 29-year-old Hasidic history professor was stabbed to death. The man charged with that killing has been acquitted of it. Last December, a Jewish man living in the area was charged with beating a black man, and so it goes. In that same summer of 1991, in the Canarsie area of Brooklyn, a firebomb destroyed the Fillmore real estate offices, which had been showing local homes to African Americans. The following is a chronology of events merely in that month and in that summer after that bombing. July 4th, a fire destroys a Pakistani-owned grocery store. July 16th, a swastika is drawn on the door of a neighborhood house. Again on July 16th, a Hispanic man receives a threatening letter stating, "We don't want you here." On July 19th, a white woman is attacked by a black woman who slashes her arm with a broken bottle and calls her a white honky bitch. On July 27th, a white homeowner receives call telling him, "If you continue to show your homes to blacks, you will end up like the Fillmore Realty." On July 30th, a white homeowner receives a call saying, "I'll burn your house and put a bullet in your kid's head if you sell your house to niggers." August 1st, a black man holding his 2-year-old daughter is knocked down by 4 white men and slashed on the arm. August 2nd, 2 white teenagers are beaten with sticks by a group of black men, and on and on. There have been smaller incidents and as destructive in their way. In January 1992, in the Bronx, 4 white youths calling themselves the Albanian Bad Boys attacked 2 younger black kids whom they beat and robbed, then sprayed with a sneaker whitening paint. They told the black kids, "Y'all turn white today." That incident, though non-lethal, went to the heart of the city's turmoil. Inside the expressed hatred lies the unexpressed wish that religions and races other than one's own would disappear from the face of the city and the earth. You all turn white today, and thus eliminate the competition. Now let me take you briefly to the Sudan on the other side of the world during the same period of time. In 1988, a junior officer named Bashir took over the government and established a fundamentalist, Muslim fundamentalist sect in power, whose whole purpose was to effect the ethnic cleansing of the Christians and the animists living in the South. There came after this what became known as the Boys' March. That is a march of boys, a trek of boys to escape from Bashir's soldiers in the Sudan. The reason for that escape being that the families of the boys were destroyed, sometimes bodies buried by a bulldozer, in towns that were taken by the government soldiers. It is the custom in the Sudan for the boys to tend the cattle, thus they were away from their families when these murders occurred, and they headed to the roads, 1, 10, thousands, hundreds of thousands, wandering to other countries surrounding the Sudan, eventually wandering back. The opposition force in the Sudan, the SPLA, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, fought the government, but it also had fights among themselves, fights between tribes, such as the Dinkas and the Nuers, fights between fractional break-off groups. A man named John Garang, who was educated here, is the leader of the SPLA, and I interviewed him in a camp in the Sudan when I was there several weeks ago. It was a scene you would not forget. In the middle of this wasteland where there is nothing, no food, no medicines, no life, only fear. He is sitting in front of a table covered with a red cloth with a word processor and a printer on it. And that day he was issuing, and I would be one of the first recipients, I guess, to the press a peace offering to have peace talks with the government. I learned today when I called Nairobi, which is the place you call to learn about the Sudan, since the Sudan is really inaccessible. It is Somalia without aid, is the Sudan. When I called Nairobi, that in fact the peace offering was taken up by the government and some talks have begun in Nigeria, but the internecine wars within the SPLA have heated up and they have become almost as murderous as the original wars between the two main powers. More murder. You know about Bosnia, you know less about the Sudan, but it is all of a piece. Tribe against tribe, clan against clan, religion against religion, sect against sect, or sect against the world, as in Waco, all leading to the isolations of people and in turn leading to the reason and the substance of the new Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. What is going on here? Why has the world so turned against itself? That's what we're going to talk about in this third and last of the series, Real People, real issues. Our panel is as distinguished as ever. You are as distinguished as ever. Our procedure is as before. The panelists will talk for about 45 minutes, responding to one another, and I will put in my 2 cents once in a while. Then we will turn to you for the latter half of the evening in a sort of town meeting. The idea behind this series, as many of you know, is that real people can discuss real issues in a civilized and productive way. That is the way of the why. I'm very glad that we're ending this series with the subject of race. I cannot imagine a more urgent topic. Let me start off by introducing tonight's panel one by one. Robert MacNeil, called Robin by his friends, is a man who graces every venture he turns to. Fortunately for us, he has turned in several directions. As executive editor and co-anchor of the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour, he constructed an entirely original news program built on the odd supposition that people are intelligent and that they seek intelligence in return. As an inquisitive intellectual, Robin has turned toward the study of our language in 2 enlightening books, The Story of English and Wordstruck. As the possessor of a first-rate imagination, he has turned his hand at producing a wonderful novel, The Burden of Desire, and is at work on a new book on what it means to be a Canadian, which, of course, he is. The novel, by the way, The Burden of Desire, describes sex life in Halifax. That will give you an idea of how imaginative Robin can get. Winner of the Peabodys, Emmys, the Hubert H. Humphrey Award from the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, and many more awards, he is at his civilized best on the NewsHour when interviewing lunatics and maniacs. There is nothing in human experience as entertaining as watching some demonstrable nutcase rave and rant on the program, with Robin interjecting at the end of each rant, "I see." A pleasure to introduce Robin MacNeil. Art on nature's scale, at once grand and intimate. That is how one astute reviewer described Jessye Norman's magisterial voice. Sometimes when we listen to her, we wonder if nature might not be jealous. Among the fortunate halls her varied operatic repertoire has taken her are the Deutsche Oper Berlin, La Scala Milan, Covent Garden, the Vienna and Hamburg State Opera, and luckily for New Yorkers, of course, the Met. In July 1989, television audiences around the world saw and heard her sing the Marseillaise at the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. A fair trade, it seems to me, for France and the gift of the Statue of Liberty. Her awards are multiple, including an appointment in 1990 as honorary ambassador to the United Nations. Her generosity is plentiful. She recently sang at the dedication of the Washington Holocaust Memorial Museum. And she has most recently been involved with Take Our Daughters to Work Day, yesterday. I would not at all mind being a little girl going with Jessye Norman to work, say in Paris or Florence. A pleasure to introduce Jessye Norman. I was thinking of Dr. Ruth Westheimer the other day when, in Barnes & Noble, I found myself engrossed by the section called Personal Growth. I was admiring a book entitled How to Keep Your Woman Satisfied All the Time and Yet Have Her Beg for More. A logical contradiction, nonetheless intriguing. Dr. Ruth did not write that book. But through her immense success on radio and television, she has in fact made the subject of sex at once serious, charming, accessible, thoughtful, and sympathetic. She was a child in a Swiss orphanage for German Jewish students during the Nazi decimation of Europe. As a teenager, she fought for Israeli independence as a member of Haganah. After earning degrees at the New School and Columbia University, she worked for Planned Parenthood and taught at several universities, producing many books, and eventually bringing her remarkable teaching skills to the mass media with such programs as The Dr. Ruth Show, Ask Dr. Ruth, and the, I assume deliberately, mischievously entitled, What's Up, Dr. Ruth? Her new show on nostalgia television is called Never Too Late. Optimism and nostalgia. And she is now added to her many duties that of presidency of the Washington Heights and Inwood Y, and she unabashedly says that she is here to seduce this audience to the Washington Heights Y. Be careful when Dr. Ruth seduces. It is always time for Dr. Ruth. A pleasure to introduce Dr. Ruth Westheimer. I want to start off with the same question for all our panelists, and I will start, if I may, with you, Dr. Ruth, and then we will just go from there, as we usually do. What was your most memorable personal experience with racism? Something that happened to you or something you observed? What has been your most memorable personal experience with racism?
In addition to not being able to reach the floor because I'm short, seriously speaking right now, because that's what we are here for. As many of you know, I was born in Frankfurt, and I was sent to Switzerland, and if my mother and grandmother hadn't put me on that train on a gray morning on January 5th, 1939, I would not be here, because they did the supreme sacrifice of sending their only child and granddaughter into safety, thinking that they would come and pick myself and the other children up on their way to going someplace, to some country that might accept them. The reason I said mother and grandmother is because right after the Kristallnacht, right after the November 9th of 1938, my father was taken to a labor camp. It wasn't a concentration camp yet. And they told me that if I don't join this group, I was an only child, if I don't join this group of children, he would not be able to come back to Frankfurt. So I had no choice. I do remember, because I come from an Orthodox Jewish background, that every Friday night I went with my father to synagogue. I also remember that he used to keep a little money, some change, in the vest pocket of his vest, just enough to buy that one ice cream cone. And my first realization that something terrible is going to happen was on that way to synagogue, because I remember when other people who were on that same way were whispering, looking with furtive glances, and were saying some terrible things are going to happen. As this audience, of course, knows that after the conference in Evian, where they tried to save German Jewry at the time, nothing happened, and there was at least that one cry, let's save the children. My first actual experience with horrible things to happen was a few days later, very early on a Sunday morning, a knock at the door, and I will never forget those boots of the Nazis coming into the apartment and demanding that my father goes with him. There was no shouting and no hitting at that time. I do remember my grandmother wearing a very long skirt and having some money in the seam of that skirt, giving it to the Nazis and saying that they should take good care of my father. I did realize that this was bad. I do remember the last time I saw my father was looking out of the window. He was a slight man with a mustache, turning around, entering in a truck, turning around and mustering a little smile to us who were looking at the windows. That was the last time I saw my father. I have to tell you that sitting here, I'm being very honored on this company here. I'm a little sad because of a couple of reasons. Somehow the world hasn't learned a thing.
Absolutely.
Here it is 50 years later. In the meantime, as you have heard, I fought in the Haganah. I was badly wounded. I go to Israel quite often. The one time before the last, there were stones thrown by little children, not any older than I was when I left Frankfurt, at a car that I was riding in. And I looked at the parents of these children, and they did not do anything to stop the children. Last year, at the Frankfurt Book Fair, I do go every year because that's part of my professional obligation. I was very sad because some Jewish people who live in Frankfurt said to me, if it wasn't for the Jews from Eastern countries, all of this misery in Germany right now wouldn't happen. Which means nothing, absolutely nothing, was learned. And what I'm worried is for my grandchild right now. Last Sunday, not this Sunday, the Sunday before last, I was at Madison Square Garden. And one young student made a very eloquent talk. And one thing he said, that very soon, people will be able to say the Holocaust never happened. Because that generation, and including me, is going to pass on. And what he said, which really haunts me, he said those people who have the number on their arm are not going to be around anymore. So I'm pleased that we are sitting here discussing this because it is terribly worrisome.
Jessye?
When I'm asked this question, I find it very difficult to choose. I would like to perhaps start with being a child growing up in Augusta, Georgia, in the 60s. I was a member of the youth division of the NAACP, and we were going to have, on a Sunday, a demonstration by children for civil rights. We had chosen the place where we were going to demonstrate. It was a large supermarket that had been for years in what was predominantly a black neighborhood, and there weren't any blacks working in the store. So we thought that this was a fair mark. And as the demonstration was being organized for children on a Sunday with police present and all the required permits obtained and all the rest of it, one wasn't really expecting trouble. I was among the marchers and the chanters with my sign, chanting away, and at one moment during the demonstration, I heard somebody scream behind me, and without that scream, I'm not sure if I would be here today. There was a car coming down the street out of nowhere that was aiming itself for our group. And if we hadn't heard this scream and dispersed, I'm not sure that we would have managed. The car came down the street, jumped the curb, and tried to, with all his might, hit us. He missed. I think he's still in jail. But I would like to tell about something that's happened more recently. Most of you know what it is I do for a living, my real job. Racism can sometimes be rather subtle. Prejudice can sometimes wear a very strange hat. I was rehearsing in London at Covent Garden, and we were doing a special concert for a very special lady. She happens to be the queen over there. We were going to do some music of Scott Joplin. That seems to be one of her favorite composers. And we were rehearsing with this conductor. I will spare you knowing who he is. We were rehearsing the music, which obviously he did not know. And at some point during the very last rehearsal, I couldn't contain myself any longer, and I raised my hand to say, "Excuse me, maestro, but could we discuss the tempo?" And he said, "Well, what's wrong with the tempo?" I said, "It's about half as fast as it needs to be, what with it being ragtime and so on." And he said, we were doing several other things, European composers on the concert as well, so it wasn't as though Scott Joplin was the only name going. And we had had discussions about tempi for the Schubert, for the Berlioz, for the Wagner. And he seemed to have taken offense that I wanted to discuss the tempo of the Scott Joplin. And he said, "Well, why don't you tell us how it goes? After all, it's your music." I thought that was rather interesting. It's difficult to stop. I could go on for hours.
Robin.
Well, in some ways I'm a bit of a fraud on this panel because, obvious from my complexion and ethnic background, that it's very unlikely that I have any personal experience of the kind of racism or discrimination that blacks have had and still have, and that Jews had notoriously and still have. Incidentally, we were at dinner with some people the other night, and we're talking about the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and one man who's a fine man and well-informed said, "Yes, but why do you need a museum like that in the United States? I mean, maybe in Europe." I don't think he even knew that there are quite a few other memorials to the Holocaust all over the United States. He said, "Why do you need it?" And I recalled a wonderful article in the New Republic of that week by Leon Wieseltier, who said, if you go through that museum, which I haven't had the privilege of doing yet, but I've read a lot about, if you go through that museum in Washington and come out thinking it's about the Jews, you haven't got the point.
Yes.
I grew up in Canada, and about as innocent of racism as one could be. The only blacks I ever saw were porters on the sleeping car trains when I was a kid. We didn't know any Jews, and as far as I'm concerned, my parents were rather benign about the whole thing. My father fought in the Second World War because Hitler was evil. But, so I was very innocent of these emotions. My grandmother came from Tennessee and adapted to life in Nova Scotia, and told me frequently she had a rather cold and distant mother, and how the black woman who looked after her was the real warmth and feeling in her childhood. So I had that kind of comforting image about it. But a number of things happened to me as a reporter that I observed as a reporter, and a couple of them come to mind immediately, because it was the end of my innocence. And you'd think this happened to me in my early 30s. I was in Europe and Africa and the Middle East as a reporter for a long time. I came back to Washington, and I was assigned, this is spring of '63, and I was assigned to cover the civil rights struggle for quite a lot of that summer, alternating between that and the Kennedy White House. And I was sent to Birmingham in June 1963. And we were there the first evening with a crew from NBC, and our orders were to wait in our motel with a little radio and listened to the police radio because we were expecting a bombing. There were bombings, a lot of bombings in Birmingham. And we waited, and being hardened journalists, we had to have something to drink, so I went down to the liquor store to buy a bottle of scotch. And I walked into the liquor store, and for the first time in my life, I saw the store divided with a rather shabby end of the counter behind a rope for blacks and the rest of the counter for whites. I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen it before, and it really struck me. A couple of evenings later, I was in a church in Birmingham with Martin Luther King and a number of others of the movement, and it was very ugly outside, and the crowds, white crowds, grew larger and more threatening, and the police did nothing about it. There were stones thrown. We were packed inside the church because the congregation couldn't get out. There was nowhere to go. And so for about 2 hours, we were all pressed against each other, shoulder to shoulder, in the lobby of that church. And the fear of all these people, and quite justifiable fear, was so palpable to me that I think I experienced a very strong vicarious sense of that. So those would be two experiences. Another brief one, because it isn't confined to blacks and whites. Racism and or the kind of hostility to somebody of another ethnic or religious group, it's most obvious in clear racial divisions. For instance, I was covering the war against the French in Algeria. I was with the French unit once on a day when there weren't supposed to be any demonstrations. And there was a huge demonstration, a demonstration to liberate Algeria from French rule at the top of a hill where there was an apartment development, and a French detachment went up the hill to stop the demonstration. And I went up with them with my little tape recorder. I was working for NBC still. Went up with them. We got to the top of the hill. There were a couple of shots from the apartment building, and we all ducked. And then the French troops lined up along the edge of the hill, and the apartment balconies were lined with Algerian men, women, and children, packed. And the women were all doing this, you, as a sign of their way of doing a demonstration. And the French opened up at that building, at men, women, and children, with everything they had. The fusillade lasted a minute and a half, and many were killed and many were wounded. And I went up. When it stopped, we went up. People were lying dead everywhere, wounded, moaning. And an Algerian man rushed up to me, thinking I was perhaps a medic or something, with a little boy of about 8 or 9 in his hands, with his thigh bare and a huge bullet hole through the thigh, and the little boy had gone white underneath his dusky complexion. And it struck me, as it struck me many times since, that for the French soldiers, these people, because they were Algerians and looked different and were of a different tribe and slightly different race, were less than human. And I hope we can talk about that, because I think that is the psychological instrumentality, and I won't go on about it now, but I think that is what it is that permits something to click in the human brain, in all of us at times, which transforms the person here into something less human than I am, and therefore disposable, torturable, enslavable, whatever.
Let's pick up from that idea. And if I may, Ruth, turn to you. Is there a foundation in psychology for thinking of the self as something to be protected and the other as something to be abhorred and non-human?
I don't think that there is something inherent in psychology, because even so, I lost my whole family in concentration camp. As you do know, I'm very much of an optimist. That's why I'm so glad that we are sitting here. But I think you are absolutely right, because you can only do such acts of inhumanity if your brain can say these are not people. So it is like a brainwashing by saying these are not like us. And once you say these people are not like us, you have distanced yourself. And then you can do these kind of terrible, terrible acts. And I heard you say before about how appropriate it is that we are sitting here today. Because I have to say something about my particular expertise. I'm not worried about any of the images and any of the movies that talk with my specialty. What I'm worried is we are opening the television and we see violence. Our children are growing up with a tremendous amount of violence, and it has that implication that these people are not like us. Therefore, it's all right to see mass graves, it's all right to see misery without us losing sleep. How come that we are sleeping at night after watching the 11 o'clock news?
I'd like to ask Dr. Ruth a question and just preface it by I'm not a scientist, and I may be totally off base in this, but I have a strong conviction that racism, to use a vague term, is probably inherent in the human spirit to this extent, that going back to our most primitive times, it was probably part of our flight and fright system for which we are geared, and for which all our endocrine glandular system is genetically programmed to cause us to respond with fear and flight when we feel threatened. And it is quite natural to feel threatened immediately by somebody who is different. And the more different they look, not only are they strange, but the more different they look, the more the automatic animal response is probably at least caution and distance. However, I think the human being is infinitely educable out of this. What happens, unfortunately, is that fear or anxiety or anything else has so easily become institutionalized into human nature through nationalism, tribalism, religious observance of various kinds, so that, and all the scapegoating, and to use one of Hitler's chief instruments, all the blame, the scapegoating for the reason the thunder comes, or the crops don't come, or the crops don't grow, or the floods come, or the rains don't come, whatever, in primitive times, but in modern times for the lack of jobs in Brooklyn, for the racism, for instance, which implies that Koreans are somehow unfairly advantaged because they have a kind of family structure and a work ethic which puts them at some economic advantage in situations like that. I think it is something fundamental and primitive in us, which is easily educated out of us once we find that that people who are different are not a threat. But it is so easy for us to be manipulated into thinking that they are a threat, that I think that explains a lot of the history of the human race. We are easily exploitable and manipulable by leaders, whether they are religious, national, military, thugs, villains, terrorists, whatever you want to say, messiahs, whatever.
I don't think so.
Yeah?
No.
Good.
Because first of all, I can't afford to think so, because otherwise immediately everybody who is 4'7" would be out of the race to start with. So I agree with you that it is during the early socialization that this kind of educative process happens. But I cannot think that it is inherent. I understand what you are saying, but it doesn't make sense to me that it would be like animals when something is frightening. I think it is the way we grow up, the way that very early socialization is happening. When my boy, who was born here, my daughter, when my boys said to me, seeing a black person, does that get washed off? Mm-hmm. What I did is I went out, and in those days, it's 30 years ago, it wasn't so easy. I went out and bought a black doll, but it couldn't just be a black doll. It had to be a black doll that can go into the bathtub with him. Yeah. And that was the end of that. Yeah. So I think it has to do with our having to be very conscious. You know, when I worked in Harlem, I worked for 3 years in Harlem at the height of the unrest, 1967 to 70. And here I am, little Jewish lady, white, training paraprofessionals for family planning work, Puerto Rican and black. And there were many of these sensitivity trainings. That's why I'm so sad. That's so long ago, and we are at the same place. And the people used to say, you know, how do you feel about black people? And to step one moment into my professional expertise, a man asked me, and I looked him straight into the face, and I remember his name, I'm not going to say his name. I said, I'll tell you, for me, men fall into two categories. One, that I would stay on an island for 7 years and nothing would happen, and one, something would happen the first night. And I told him, with you, it would happen the first night. And that was the end of that.
Wonderful. I would like to say, too, that I would hope that we as human beings are a bit more advanced as humans, that we wouldn't have this an inherent behavior that would make us run away from a person simply because that person looks different from us. I want to say that I feel that racism is born in a feeling that is about inhumanity. It is a very deep, for me, a very deep spiritual hole that we seem to have inside of us. And I think that until we are able to look at racism, prejudice, bias in this way as something that is lacking inside of a person, not something that has to be, that is there because it just comes from having evolved from a Neanderthal or whatever. I think that this is something that comes from training. I agree with that we can learn very early, and that it is never too early to learn to understand humanity and to understand that you must look at another person with the same feeling that you have for yourself. I have to tell you a very short story. I was singing in, these things seem to keep happening in London. I was singing there, and I was singing in a place that's not normal for concerts, and I was using the house of somebody who lived nearby to warm up. And the family, of course, was downstairs, and I was using the bit upstairs. And I came down the stairs, sort of in my outfit, going off to do the concert in the cathedral, and there was a very young child in the arms of one of the persons standing there. And the child looked at me and said, "Mother, she has golden skin." And the mother said, "Oh, excuse me, she doesn't know." I said, "She's not too young to learn."
But I have a question to you.
Yeah.
Because what you said, especially when you also referred back to Hitler, you said that out of the economic problems, because what I'm trying to understand, why are we in this situation today? 1993, why have we not learned? And maybe what you said is the issue of the economics, that if times are tough and if jobs are not plentiful, that maybe that's when all of this ugliness rears its head.
If you were to substitute the word poor for an opposition, clan, tribe, race, religion, would it be the same thing? Is it the same impulse? To look down, to compete? Is it
I think the human race has well-established and well-documented capacity to look down on the poor and not see them and ignore them. I mean, all of us who live in New York are daily confronted with this now that homelessness has become such a feature of the landscape. But I think whenever threats to people are increased, going back to rats in the cage, the greater the number of rats in the cage, the more frantically they behave. I think whenever threats on human beings, or perceived threats, are increased, or a sense of anxiety, the level of anxiety is raised, some of the less admirable human qualities come out, and I think that's undeniable, and it's very understandable. I don't argue against anything, Dr. Ruth, that you've said, or Jessye Norman, that you've said, that we are educable, and I said that to begin with. It's just that we are not as educated as we would like to think we are. For instance, public television showed last week a wonderful documentary on the revived exhibition of depraved art. I don't know whether you saw it. The famous exhibition from the 30s of all the art that Hitler considered depraved and unseemly. And the Germans have put that together again from all over the world and shown it in Berlin. And it is marvelous to see now and really fascinating to see. And the commentary in the documentary was very interesting because it quoted many of the things that that Hitler's flunkies were saying about this art and what it illustrated of impurities in the race and one thing and another. Well, I've just, you were kind enough to mention it, finished a year ago this novel about my hometown, Halifax, during the 1917 war. And many of the things, I hate to say this, but many of the things that Hitler was saying about Jews, about homosexuals, about cosmopolitans, about art that was savage and primitive, and because it was non-figurative and didn't show human beings in their prettiest and most sublime forms, those were things that people in my hometown, and well-educated and quite sophisticated people, were probably thinking about modern art, about the dissonant music of Stravinsky, certainly about the works of Freud, certainly about the novels of D.H. Lawrence and James Joyce, and I could go on about the work of Havelock Ellis, about Margaret Sanger, about many things. The intolerance, even in very well-educated, civilized people who'd traveled and everything else, the general intolerance of the bourgeoisie in Western culture, I think was, and how easily they are pushed over into these things. I mean, after all, it was, as has so often been said, if not the most civilized and cultured nation in Europe, certainly one of the 2 or 3 most civilized and cultured nations of Europe, and their bourgeoisie who allowed themselves to rationalize or look the other way at what happened to the Jews.
Why now? Why does it seem so urgent to us now? Ruth, in her opening remarks, mentioned 50 years pass from one terror to a new set of terrors. Communism falls apart, and tribes of Eastern Europe go at each other as if nothing had been there, as if communism itself had only been there to restrain them. Why, if it is not something inherent, are we faced now with example after example of terrifying competition and fear and hatred of difference?
I think that it is possible to be very well educated and to be very sophisticated and to be spiritually dead. I think that it is possible to be, as we are, Americans living in this country, and to have gone through 12 years of spiritual deadness, where it has become fashionable again, where it became fashionable because we weren't helped by these leaders that we elected, that we weren't helped by them to understand that it is our responsibility to help people that are less well off, that are less well educated, that have had less opportunity to grow as human beings than we have. I think that when it became fashionable again to say the things that are now said. I can't count the number of times per day. I think that people forgot about the things that they had learned, perhaps, that you have to treat another person as you would like to be treated in order to be a real human being. I think that this has been cast aside because it was okay again. We were making an effort somehow in the 60s and 70s to try to understand one another, to try to see, well, will these government programs help? Will it help to make it possible for people that are really very bright but very poor to go to very good schools? They might find that they can help this society. All of that fell away. It wasn't any more important to those people that we put in Washington. And I'm not blaming them for all of this, but I'm saying that they helped.
I would blame them for some of it. I think, no,
Oh, yes.
I really do. Because it is unfortunately true, and this isn't by any means all Republicans or all members of the Bush administration, that would be crazy, but certainly there was an effort, it was very apparent at the Republican convention last summer, to divide the country, and there have been subtle signals said. I mean, how could black Americans or liberal white Americans interpret the great lack of interest in pursuing affirmative action and the exploitation of the backlash against affirmative action, just to mention one thing. So I think there was an effort to play the politics of race, sometimes quite knowingly and cynically. The 1988 campaign with the notorious Willie Horton commercial, which the Bush campaign disavowed but somehow didn't manage to get stopped on television, was another example. So by some people, there was quite an effort, to undo some of the programs. The Legal Defense Fund is another example. Some of the programs to undo some of the things that had divided us, not necessarily on racial grounds, but on religious grounds, to, for instance, the abortion issue, which has been largely solved in other civilized countries, with a degree of tolerance and some control. Many politicians in this country found it worth their while to pick at the scabs of that. Roger's written a very eloquent book about it, to pick at the scabs for political effort. And so we have this society roiling still with a matter that has been largely dealt with in, for instance, Canada, where I come from. So I think that you can, to some degree, blame some politicians for having, undone some of the programs, underfunding Head Start, allowing Head Start to languish a bit when it was recognized by everybody, although it may not be the panacea some people think it is still a marvelous and successful program for doing what you've just described. But the other part of it is that it's a funny evolution that's happened. With great goodwill, the country, especially after John Kennedy's assassination, got behind Lyndon Johnson and passed two seminal historic civil rights bills, and the country was largely behind those after they'd passed. And I think we were all carried forward to the extent that many, many people of your race have benefited extraordinarily from that, and we as whites have benefited too, to see that we're not losing. We're beginning to employ and benefit from the talents of people of all races. That has been a marvelous advance, and we can all see the examples of it throughout. But the other side of it is that a great many people have been left behind, and precious little has been done for them. You've only to look at the statistics the New York Times published the other day in those pie charts of the prison populations in the three tri-state states of the tri-state area, and roughly half of the prison populations, and it's true throughout the country, are black. This country has more people in prison as a percentage of its population than any country in the world now. It used to be behind the Soviet Union. It used to be behind South Africa. Now it's number one, a great thing to be proud of. And more than half those people are black in a country where blacks represent less than 15% of the population. And they're there largely because of the crimes that are committed against other blacks, but are the crimes that spring up and grow in conditions of poverty, lack of education, lack of employment, lack of opportunity, And I'm not just making the simple liberal cop-out that all crime is caused by social conditions, but it's pretty well demonstrable that a great deal is.
Robin, Jessye, Ruth, I'm going to now take this opportunity to open our discussion to members of the audience who may have questions, and then anything that you would have said you might frame within the context of those questions.
Hello. This one works.
Yes, now. Yes? Yes, sir.
Well, first let me...
Forgive me, if I will try to repeat the question for the audience if the audience does not hear the question from the individual.
First let me thank Jessye Norman for the finest concert I ever was at, and all the second person conducted.
Very kind.
The question, though, is if what you say is true, and you all believe it, we're sitting here because we want to come to hear this. The people that are not here
Are the people who need to hear?
have to hear this.
Yes.
How do we educate the people that won't come here, and the people that did elect Reagan and Bush for 12 years and won't come here to hear this? How do we educate those people?
That's a wonderful question.
We've, at the risk of being self-serving, a little bit of advertisement, after the Los Angeles riots on our program, the News Hour, we carried for about 4 months regular interviews by Charlene Hunter-Gault in a series, Can We Get Along? And then, Why Can't We Get Along? They won't watch Channel 13? Well,
That's why
I think television is one clear route. A great deal of television news, unfortunately, especially at the local level, it seems almost deliberately designed, although the producers would deny that, to increase the paranoia and increase racial stereotypes, because it,
Absolutely.
on the steady diet of violent crime and the steady appearance of young black faces increases the perception that A, the country is more dangerous, more crime-ridden than it even is, and that there is risk. It's now true. We did a story on this some years ago with a bunch of black youths in this city. If you're black and young and you run down a street in Manhattan, the probability is that people are going to assume that you've committed some crime. You may be a carefree teenage kid who's running to the bus from school. But it is, so I think television does some considerable good, because there are a lot of shows. I mean, Donahue and Oprah and a lot of programs like that do a great deal to try and give positive messages and images. At the same time, and so do a great many of the entertainment programs. After all, blacks have become, in commercials and in entertainment programs, visible in the last generation on American television as middle-class Americans with the same aspirations that everybody else has, in a way they were not 20 years ago. But the other side of it is what I've described on the news, which just increases paranoia, resentment, fear, stereotypes.
What happens on Channel 13, we all love, that we know. But there are other television networks out there. And there's still, to my knowledge, I try not to watch it too much, there's an awful lot of the idea of the stereotype still very prevalent in these shows. I've kept a treatment of a proposed television show because I simply, when I read the treatment, I could not believe it. I could not believe that I was reading this whenever it was, in October of 1992. That someone would have had the courage to send me a treatment of a television program for which they thought I might want to have a role. That was about 3 women working in suburban Chicago as maids. Black maids working in suburban Chicago, that someone would actually send me via Federal Express. It was very important. A treatment to consider. This is network television. This is the kind of thing they're still considering. When I was growing up, I thought that television was meant to be an educational thing. It was all meant to be like the kind of wonderful programming. I sound like I'm sort of doing a commercial for Channel 13. But it was meant to all be like that. I would love one day to be locked in a room with the people that head NBC, CBS, and ABC to talk to them about what it is that they think they're doing with these shows that they have on television. Because I tell you, this perpetuates what's wrong with what's going on in this world. I tell you it does.
Jessye, can you picture the moment when the guy who had the idea for that show said, "I've got it"?
We'll send it to Jessye.
A singing maid.
Absolutely.
And we'll
She'll
have her
love
sing
it.
at the end of every show.
She'll get a lot of money, so therefore she'll have to love it. That's how they
Absolutely.
think.
Ruth, were you going to say something?
Again, I want to take a different side. Instead of, like the rabbis do, always saying, why are those people out there not at the service? I want to take the other side, and I want to say, look at this superb audience here who take the trouble of going out, there are many other things to do in a city like New York, in order to sit around talking about this serious subject matter. So I'm taking it by saying, look at this. There are people here who are concerned about it. And I take that as a positive step.
Yes, you, madam.
I have a lot of questions, but I have two brief answers to what you said, because I work at the Anti-Defamation League, and we have a program called The World of Difference, which is about consciousness raising and bringing people together and intergroup relationships. But also, there's something else. We have to make our legislators enforce hate crimes. You can't make people love each other, but you can sure punish them if they act on it.
Mm-hmm.
You can sure do something about their actions. So both of those are sort of answers there. But I have one question, which I don't know if there's an answer or if I'm looking for an affirmation. One of the problems in America is we're a very violent country because we were born out of violence. And I don't know how that pertains to us vis-a-vis other countries. Are we more violent in our origins?
Let me just repeat
Certainly
the question before the panel takes, so that I'm sure people in the balcony hear it. The question was, since America was born of violence, that is, born of a revolution, are we more violent than other countries, and does that contribute to or exacerbate the relationships among groups?
Well,
Anybody want to
look
address
at
that?
I mean, there are plenty. The French had a far more violent and bloody revolution and sequel to their revolution than America did. Britain and France, between them, fought each other again and again, and fought civil wars within. Look at Russia, look at the others. I don't know a good explanation for the violence of this country, except it had struck me for many years. I remember testifying to the President's Commission on Violence in 1968, after I'd written a book critical of network television. And I don't think anything has got anything but worse since then. We still, in this culture, glorify violence. It's the staple of our most popular form of entertainment is violence. Violence is portrayed to children, you said it earlier, as the, usually, the best solution to frustration and problems. How many murders, we've seen any count, 20,000 murders a child sees on television depicted fictionally by the time he's 15 or 14, whatever it is. I think whatever the origins, which are probably a bit inexplicable, and they may go to the racism against the Indians, they may go to the cult of the West, they may be because of the marvelous ferment of the American experiment. No other country tried it. Canada is now beginning to. It's now going through the experience of heterogeneity, racial and ethnic heterogeneity that this country did. Nobody ever tried before bringing all the races in, bringing all the religions in, putting it all together and letting it seethe and having the best and most creative free spirits bubble up from that, and there probably because the country is not homogeneous in the way England was after it settled down from 1,500 years of migrations and finally has had 200 or 300 years to kind of settle down and look calm. But it's not so much the origins of the violence here, which are probably very hard to put our finger on. It is the perpetuation of violence and the idea that it is such a saleable commodity. If the manufacturers of this country who advertise on all the most popular television programs in which there are 13 shootings and punchings and one thing every 5 minutes, if they really wanted to get together and do something about violence in this country, they could withdraw their commercials from these programs. But it sells. Violence is sexy, and violence sells in this country in a way that it's interesting. I'm going to stop in a moment. I'm sorry to go on. But I worked for a long time in Britain for the BBC and lived there working for other people. When American television programs are imported to Britain, and they're very popular, many of them, they censor them for violence. They take out what they consider excessive, gratuitous violence that has no artistic merit or doesn't contribute to the essential intrinsic quality of the thing. When British programs come here, they censor the sexiness.
Yes.
Ruth, you wanted to say something?
No, he just said it.
Very good. Yes, sir, you.
Yes.
Why don't more black personalities speak out against black racism?
wish
May I
I could
repeat the
answer
question
that.
before Jessye answers? The question is, why don't more prominent black personalities speak out against racism among blacks? Is that correct? By blacks?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I'm not sure that they don't. I mean, I don't know that they don't. If you tell me that you don't see enough African American faces that are well known saying to the world that this really has to stop, haven't we had enough of it? I really can't answer that. I can only say what I said some time ago, that if you are not spiritually connected to the person next to you, you don't care. And this isn't something that I can't identify with the person who can't care. So I don't know why people don't speak out. Are they worried about their jobs? Are they worried about losing half of that 85 million they get for hitting a ball across the field? I don't know. I don't know what the problem is. I only know that it comes from whether or not the person is an unknown kindergarten teacher or a well-known dancer or whatever. If you speak out, if you care, and if you don't, it doesn't matter what it is you do for a job. I don't know how else to answer that question.
Certainly prominent African Americans have been speaking out in greater numbers recently. I think of Barbara Jordan at the convention, the Democratic convention, and Henry Louis Gates in an article in the New York Times.
I wish you'd write to them and ask them. Excuse me, Ruth.
Sorry, in the back.
A few days ago, there was a documentary on PBS about race relations on campuses across the United States. And it showed that the black students congregate separately together and shy away from integrating with the rest of the population on campus in the fraternity or in the dining hall or in other activities, and anybody of the black student body who doesn't try to communicate or integrate with the white fraternities or organizations is sort of ostracized by the rest of the black community. I can understand it. I would like to have some understanding of why that happens.
If I may, I'm going to broaden the question a bit. The question had to do with black fraternities and the reverse kind of discrimination that the gentleman saw in a documentary highlighting that. I wanted to broaden the question a bit because we talked about the conservative impulse towards separatism. There is also a liberal impulse towards separatism and multiculturalism now, certainly not just among blacks, but among all races, all ethnic groups, where one is taught quite contrary to the atmosphere in which the four of us, and I believe most in this room, were educated, that instead of being an American, you are a Cambodian or a Korean or black or white or whatever separate group you would be relegated to. So I wonder if the panel might talk about that as an impulse too, this new multiculturalism, and how or if that contributes to racism.
I didn't see this particular program about which you're speaking, but I spend a lot of time at colleges and universities in this country, and I have been taken with this separatism on the part of ethnic groups on college campuses. And one of the things, and I spent a lot of time at one college, which I won't name, up north, talking to the people that should be responsible for bringing the members of the student body together. I was amazed. They were very proud to tell me that you have to understand, we have found African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina that had wonderful SAT scores, and they're now our students, and they're really outstanding. And we have students that we have found in Baltimore, Maryland, and Oklahoma, and all the rest of it. And we brought these students way up here in the middle of nowhere to this fantastic university. And we don't understand why they don't really mix well with the other students. And I said to them, who's in charge of seeing to it that this happens? That a person who has grown up in the inner city in Baltimore, Maryland, could be expected to go to New England somewhere, to a fantastic school where there isn't a black church, there is no black community, he has nothing there that he's used to having. The person that is responsible for trying to bring the student body together hasn't worked out quite how to do it. What do you expect them to do? They're not going to turn into some kind of marvelous, I don't know, different kind of creation just because now they're on your wonderful campus. They have brought you a lot of fears, a lot of habits, a lot of problems. They need to be helped. You're not doing that. They're not going to do it on their own. So whereas I really am opposed to the separatism, I think that the colleges themselves need to do a lot more to make those students that they have given the wonderful opportunity for this education, and I mean that, it is a wonderful opportunity. They have to make them feel that now that you are here, we're going to make you feel a part of what is going on. Just as we need to do this on college campuses, we need to do that for the entire country. We are all in this together. As they say, we're all connected. And we have to understand that, whether we're on a college campus or whether we're in the middle of Baltimore.
I absolutely endorse what Jessye Norman says, but I would add a dimension going back to what Roger suggested. I think the new respect for, if that's the word, multiculturalism, may in some way contribute to this, because it is for the first time attempting, in its most positive aspect, to put a value on the cultures that, for instance, African American can look to, which has some resonance to them to increase their self-esteem and respect. Sometimes it's exaggerated, the contributions of historic Africans to Western culture, and of course, historically, it has been devalued by the Eurocentric culture. It is an attempt by this huge, unwieldy machine made up of people who are both resistant and of goodwill, which is the whole spectrum of higher education, to somehow compensate for generations of Eurocentric instruction. And of course, there's a backlash against that as well. There are blacks we've done a number of stories on exactly what the questionnaire is raising. And there are blacks on campus who feel that they are resented because it's somehow imputed to them that there is the result of sort of unfair affirmative action and that they've been admitted on lower standards. There's quite a lot of anxiety and fear about that. And it doesn't just apply to black students. It's also true of Asian American students who have congregated together. So it is partly to celebrate their differentness, which the curriculum is beginning to do in many campuses, and to give them some reason for pride in their differentness. At the same time, all the dynamics that Jessye Norman is describing are at work, and they may also feel a little paranoid about the probably generous impulse that got them there in order to create a kind of quota, at least a demonstrable quota that these universities are attempting to recruit. So I think it's a complex of reasons that does it.
You have to take a risk by stepping out and being with somebody that you do not know the background. And I think that this risk-taking, which is like a personal risk-taking by saying, I need to get to know that other person that is different, that I have no experience. This morning at a breakfast, that I was not there, but I do know what was talked about by an Israeli Arab living in Israel, whose first time who had a contact with an Israeli who happens to have been an Orthodox Jewish Israeli with a yarmulke, and they shared the room at the Hebrew University. Now, I don't know exactly how we can do this. I don't know if there should be a rule that part of your 4 years university education, you have to take that risk. I'm a little worried because I come out of Nazi Germany, and that will then sound like a dictator if I'm saying on the campus that I'm the professor, I need you people to mingle. On the other hand, I agree with you. If we do not encourage that, nothing gets accomplished.
Nothing.
After the 4 years, there is not any more knowledge of what is happening.
And it is knowledge.
Yes.
Yes.
And you had all talked before about the necessity of educating, literally, and from the Latin, leading out of an ignorant and frightened state into something more compromising and generous. There's a gentleman in the balcony, yes.
How does the use of the term political correctness intersect with racism? I wonder if that's a topic.
The question is, how does the term and the idea of political correctness intersect with racism?
Well, as I understand it, it is an attempt which many consider has gone too far to back off racism to the extent that you don't, and sexism, and to the extent that you try to prune the language or censor the language of people so that the least imagined sensitivity of any particular group, whether it's their sexual orientation, the color of their skin, their religion, their political beliefs, anything else, will be violated. And it's introduced, at least, and it's given conservatives a wonderful weapon to beat what they see as the Marxist-dominated post-Vietnam generation faculty of many universities, particularly in English departments and maybe in philosophy departments, to beat them over the head for a new kind of authoritarianism or totalitarianism of the left. It's been a very handy tool for the Bill Buckleys and the National Review and some members of the Reagan administration and the Bush administration on the right. But that's what I understand its benign purpose to be, to shelter people from, and their sensibilities and sensitivities, from unconscious language that may be racist, sexist, and so on.
He's so eloquent that even if I want to say something, he has said it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It occurred to me tonight we've been talking about the violence and divisiveness of our society, and I would just like to thank the 4 people who are on the stage from the right
Thank you. That's very nice.
It's nice.
I thank you too, but my job as a journalist compels me to do what we call full disclosure, and that remark came from my wife, so. While I love and admire her above all creatures, male and female, I'll extend the compliment to the other three. Yes, sir.
I just meander. I think that message got across. I think there were 4 or 5 networks.
The question had to do with looking at the Republican convention for exacerbating these.
I don't think anybody
feelings
who
of
was watching and
hatred.
interested in politics failed to get that, to perceive that. That's my impression of it. But, yes.
One of the fastest growing segments of our population is Hispanic American. What are we going to do about their inability or unwillingness to learn English so we can communicate? You talk about fear.
Yeah.
If you cannot communicate both ways, you cannot eliminate fear. And that's not to take away anything from keeping their ethnicity or the power of the Spanish language, which the English language is embedded in.
Well, I have strong feelings about that. The question was,
Thank you, Robert.
what are we going to do about the inability or the unwillingness of the growing Hispanic population to learn English without taking anything away from the value of their own language or culture? I've refused to join the U.S. English movement, which attempted to recruit me after I did the series, The Story of English on Television, because when I looked into it, I was informed there are 2 movements. There's a movement to try and make English the official language of this country, as some states have attempted to do. And I'm informed by people who resist that movement that the Hispanic population of this country, growing as it is assimilating into the use of English as rapidly as any other immigrant group traditionally did in this country. That in order, it's true that there are large barrios in many American cities now, and on the New York subway, I learned my Spanish by reading about the Roach Motel in Spanish, but no puede salida. But I am reliably informed, and I tell you where this is argued. There's a quarterly magazine called English Today, which is a worldwide magazine published in Cambridge, England, but solicits articles from all over the world. It's fascinating. This is frequently argued in its pages. And if the professors who argue the point I've just made are correct, and they give all kinds of statistics to support it, then I think the other argument comes into play, raised by Hispanics, that what you do is raise a whole new opportunity for discrimination and racism. And if you ask yourself, can Hispanics really enter the full life of this country without speaking English? It is fairly obvious, I think the answer is that except for the voting, which remains controversial, I don't think it's true. I think they have to get on in American society, as all other immigrant groups did. They had to learn English. You know, the reason public schools were founded back in the mid-19th century and made compulsory is because religious groups and churches like the Lutherans in Minnesota and the German Lutherans in Wisconsin were insisting on educating the young children in their own languages only. And the only way to get them into the mainstream and force them to learn English was to have compulsory public education, and that's one of the motives for founding public schools.
What about bilingual education, which
Well, the argument, what about bilingual education, which is only an excuse to keep educating them in Spanish? The people who are supporters of bilingual education, and while some will agree that it goes too far, and we are not good in our bilingual education, the two arguments are, and I don't know which side to take on this, but the two arguments are about bilingual education for it, that the only way to bring people, and it's not just Hispanics, it's all kinds of other people, but primarily Hispanics, the only way to bring them on, excuse me, interrupting myself, in the California system, they do bilingual education in something close to 100 languages, because they have so many Montagnards and Cambodians and Vietnamese and Koreans and so on. The only way to bring a child on fairly, so that he isn't considered a dunce at his grade level, is to let him be articulate in his own language while gradually forcing him to learn English, because the modern pedagogic theory is that the old sink or swim method isn't fair to the child. Now, the argument against that, of course, is the argument that you're making, is that it is lazily done, that the child is encouraged to go on too long in his own language, is not forced or guided or encouraged. It takes a lot of extra teaching skill and extra work to make bilingual education successful. But in Canada, I just keep referring to Canada, in Canada, where they are just now having the experience of absorbing millions of immigrants from many different language groups, they think bilingual education is essential.
I want to take one more question, and then we're going to have a treat. Yes, ma'am.
Look at the smiles on them.
I don't mean to take away from the fact that blacks have been discriminated in this country by whites. But let's not forget that there is discrimination that's practiced by blacks. As a non-white and as a non-black, I have to say that if I have to choose between the two, I've experienced more racism from blacks. And the only thing I can say about that is, let's not forget that sometimes victims also turn out to be perpetrators of the very thing of which they are victims too. The second thing I wanted to say was really in response to Ms. Norman's statement with regard to how do you take an inner city child into an Ivy League college and throw them in there and hope that they integrate on their own. I can only say that that was my experience, having been plucked out of where LA was burning last spring.
Yes, today.
By Princeton University, I did not have other Filipinos to congregate with. If I wanted to segregate myself, I had to be alone. I think the answer to your question is that a lot of these people have to look within themselves, the courage and the strength to go out, shake other people's hand and say, hello, my name is.
Mm-hmm.
And that really starts a lot.
Of course it does.
I don't really have a question, just a final comment. With regard to educating people, my response to the racism I have received from blacks is I've organized my own organization to bring minority professionals to the high schools to demonstrate to not only the black kids that there are people who look like them, who've made it into this society, but also to demonstrate to the white kids and the non-black and the non-white kids that there are professionals out there who are not just white, who don't look like the people they see on television necessarily. And that's part of the education process that I think this country ought to be involved in.
It's commendable.
I hope everybody could have heard those remarks, but there's no way that I can adequately recapitulate them except to say that it was an expression of hope that the individual working for the community can override the prejudices both among minority groups and between minority groups and a majority, but that the effort as an individual has to be made, which is a very interesting observation given the fact that people like Lewis Thomas and other observers of us as a species say that we are, after all, a very young species, only about 45,000 years old, very young compared to, say, the cockroach, And that other species have learned in an odd progression, first to absorb, not to have enmity with, then to depend on, and finally not to live without their enemy. He has learned this through observation. It would be something devoutly to be wished for us. But for a wish we can achieve without going 45,000 more years, Jessye Norman has agreed to sing to us tonight.
Thank you.
Look at all the smiles.
We're going to sing something together. It's a spiritual, and I hope that after our discussion tonight that it means maybe even a little bit more than it's always meant to a lot of you that I know before. It's called He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. If you know the words, please sing with me. All right? He's got the whole world in His hand. He's got the whole wide world in His hand. He's got the whole world in His hand. He's got the whole world in His hand. Now that you've heard it, sing with me this time, all right? He's got the whole world in His hand. He's got the whole wide world in His hand. He's got the whole world in His hands. He's got the whole world in His hands. He's got the woods and the waters. He's got the woods and the waters in His hands. He's got the woods and the waters in His hand. He's got the woods and the waters in His hand. He's got the whole world in His. He's got the sun and the moon. He's got the sun and the moon in His hand. He's got the sun and the moon in His hand. He's got the sun and the moon in His hand. He's got the whole world in His hand. He's got you and me. He's got you and me in His hands. He's got you and me in His hands. He's got you and me in His hands. He's got the whole world in His. He's got everybody. He's got everybody in His hands. He's got everybody in His hand. He's got everybody in His hand. He's got the whole world in His. He's got the whole world. He's got the whole world in His hands. He's got the whole world in His hands. He's got the whole world in His hands. He's got the whole world in His hands.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.